At dinner, when I shared that I had left my old job for health reasons, my daughter-in-law mocked me. Unemployed again? How does it feel to be a loser? I simply smiled and replied, how does it feel to know you won't be living rent-free in my house anymore? Her face turned pale. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. My name is Augusta Redmond. For 35 years I was the head archivist at a major university. My life's work was the preservation of history, the careful cataloging of facts, and the quiet, unyielding defense of primary sources against the slow erosion of time and misinformation. I understand the difference between a temporary loan, like a library book that must be returned, and a permanent holding. For the last 3 years my beautiful paid-off family home had been on loan to my son and his wife. I had come to realize they had reclassified it in their minds as a permanent holding. This is the story of how I, the archivist, corrected that clerical error. It's the story of how I took a false narrative, fact-checked it against the primary source of my own generosity, and officially permanently deaccessioned it from my life. The confrontation, when it finally came, happened over a meal of roasted chicken and garlic potatoes. The dinner table in my house, the very one my late husband Samuel and I had purchased 3 decades ago, had become a silent battleground. On one side was me, the quiet, observant owner of the house. On the other was my daughter-in-law Brielle, a lifestyle blogger who treated my home like a long-term Airbnb she never had to pay for. And in the middle, a perpetual, silent Switzerland, was my son, David. The tension was a fourth, unwelcome guest at the table. For weeks I had been wrestling with a difficult decision, one that had been prompted by my doctor's stern warnings about my blood pressure and the crushing stress of a demanding job. I had finally made my choice, and I felt it was only right to share the news with the 2 people whose lives were, for the moment, intertwined with my own. I cleared my throat, the small sound loud in the strained silence. I have something to tell you both, I began, my voice calm and even. I had a meeting with my director this afternoon. I've decided to take an early retirement. I handed in my notice. For my health. Unemployed again? She asked. The question a venomous dart. How does it feel to be a loser? In that moment of stunning, ringing silence, my world narrowed to a single point of focus. My son, David, was sitting directly across from me, his head bowed, his fork moving the garlic potatoes around his plate in a meaningless circular pattern. This was it. As I waited for him to speak, the entire history of that everything played out in my mind with the cold, clear precision of a well-organized archive. I saw myself in this house, just after Samuel's funeral, the rooms echoing with a grief so profound I thought it would swallow me whole. I saw my son and his then-fiancée Brielle, their faces masks of sympathy, telling me I shouldn't be alone, and I remembered my offer, born of love and a desire to keep my family close, to keep the silence at bay. I had opened my home, this beautiful 4-bedroom house that was paid in full, a legacy of a lifetime of hard work, and I had invited them in. Live here, I had said. Save your money, build your future. There was no lease, there was no rent. The agreement was a simple one, a contract of the heart. They would have the 2 large bedrooms at the front of the house, while I would keep my own bedroom and my study at the back. We would share the kitchen, the living room, the life of the house. In exchange for this gift, a gift worth by my conservative estimate over $40,000 a year in this neighborhood, I asked for only one thing, respect. For the first year, the contract had been honored, but then the clauses of respect and gratitude had been slowly, systematically eroded. Brielle's initial performative gratitude had curdled into a creeping, insidious entitlement. My home became her content house, the backdrop for her endless stream of social media posts. My antique furniture was an inconvenience to be shoved aside for her minimalist aesthetic. My cooking was a source of smells that interfered with her scented candles. Her disrespect was 1,000 tiny cuts, a slow, methodical campaign to establish her dominance in a home she did not own. And David, my son, had been her silent, willing accomplice. He saw her casual cruelties, her snide remarks, her quiet, relentless campaign to marginalize me in my own space. But he never spoke up. He called his spinelessness keeping the peace. He reframed my legitimate hurt as me being too sensitive. He was not a peacekeeper, he was an enabler. He was a collaborator in the hostile takeover of my home. The archivist in me took over. The part of my brain that was a wounded, heartbroken mother was carefully, methodically shut down and filed away. When a precious document is threatened, an archivist does not weep. She acts with a cold, clear and decisive precision designed to neutralize the threat and preserve the integrity of the collection. My home was my collection. My peace of mind was the most valuable document within it, and my daughter-in-law was a hostile agent, an invasive species of mold that threatened to consume everything. My response, therefore, was not emotional. It was procedural. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage with her insult. To do so would have been to legitimize it, to enter into a messy, pointless debate with a person who had just proven herself to be acting in bad faith. Instead, I met her cold, triumphant gaze across the table, and I smiled. It was not a warm maternal smile. It was the calm, neutral, and deeply unnerving smile of a librarian who is about to inform you that your borrowing privileges have been permanently revoked. I let the silence stretch, letting her savor what she believed was her victory. I let her think that her brutal verbal assault had landed, that she had successfully established her dominance, that she had put the useless old woman in her place. And then, when the silence was at its most taut, its most uncomfortable, I replied. My voice was quiet, calm, and utterly devoid of the emotion she had been hoping to provoke. How does it feel? I asked. My tone as pleasant and as conversational as if I were asking her to pass the salt, to know you won't be living rent-free in my house anymore. The sentence was a perfectly crafted counter-move. It was not an insult, it was a statement of fact, a simple, logical consequence of her own actions. It was not a threat, it was a notification of a change in terms. It took the power she thought she had seized and vaporized it in an instant. It reminded her with a brutal, beautiful efficiency of the fundamental truth of her situation. She was not a queen in her castle. She was a guest in my home. A guest whose welcome had just been officially and irrevocably rescinded. The effect of my words was immediate, and deeply, profoundly satisfying. The smug, triumphant sneer on Brow's face did not just vanish. It seemed to shatter as if it were a mask made of thin, brittle glass. The color drained from her face, leaving her with a pale, chalky and unattractive complexion. Her mouth, which had been a hard, cruel line, fell open slightly, a perfect, silent O of shock and disbelief. Her eyes, which had been narrowed with contempt, were now wide with a dawning, horrifying understanding. She had overplayed her hand. She had made a catastrophic miscalculation. She had mistaken the quiet, patient archivist for a weak, helpless old woman. And she had just been informed in the clearest possible terms that her access to the archive was being terminated. My son David finally looked up from his plate. His face was a mirror of his wife's, a mask of pale, stunned confusion. He looked at me, then at Brielle, then back at me, his brain clearly struggling to process the sudden seismic shift in the room's power dynamic. "Mom," he stammered, his voice a weak, uncertain whisper. What are you talking about?" I did not look at him. My gaze remained locked on Brielle, holding her in the cold, clear beam of my newfound resolve. I simply picked up my fork, took a calm, deliberate bite of my roasted chicken and continued with my meal. The dinner ended in a stunned, horrified silence. The battle was over. The war, however, was just beginning. I finished my meal with a slow, deliberate relish. The roasted chicken, which had tasted like ash in my mouth just moments before, now seemed to be the most delicious thing I had ever eaten. Every bite was a small, quiet act of reclamation. After dinner, I did not engage in the argument that was clearly brewing in the horrified silence of my son and daughter-in-law. I simply collected my plate, took it to the kitchen, and then retreated into the one room in the house that was still unequivocally mine, my study. My mind, which had been a swirling vortex of hurt and anger, was now a calm, orderly command center. The objective was clear. The informal, verbal, and now catastrophically failed living arrangement needed to be officially nullified. The social contract had been breached, and it was now time to replace it with a cold, hard, and legally binding one. My archivist's training kicked in. When faced with a collection in disarray, the first step is always research. I sat down at my large oak desk, the familiar weight of my leather chair a comforting anchor. I did not weep. I did not rage. I opened my laptop and I began to work. I spent the next several hours in a state of deep, focused concentration, applying the same meticulous research skills I had once used to trace the provenance of a 17th-century manuscript to a new and far more personal subject: landlord-tenant law in my state. I dove into the legal databases I still had access to through the university. I read statutes and legal precedents. I cross-referenced articles and downloaded official state forms. I was searching for the specific legal framework that governed my unique situation. A homeowner with family members living on the property without a formal, written lease. They were, in the cold, precise language of the law, tenants at will. And as tenants at will, they had certain rights, but I, as the property owner, had rights as well. And I intended to exercise them to the fullest and most legally sound extent. My research confirmed what I had suspected. Because there was no lease stipulating a term of residency, I was within my legal rights to terminate their tenancy with a 30-day written notice. It was a clean, straightforward, and legally unassailable process. The key was the documentation. Everything had to be perfect. The notice had to be worded correctly. It had to be delivered properly, and it had to be notarized to stand up to any potential legal challenge. This was a battle I intended to win, not with emotional outbursts, but with a superior and more thoroughly researched paper trail. By the end of the evening, I had a complete, multi-step strategic plan. Step 1, draft the official legal documents. Step 2, have them notarized. Step 3, deliver them. Step 4, wait. The beauty of the plan was in its simplicity, its elegance, and its cold, bureaucratic impersonality. I was removing myself and my emotions from the equation. This was no longer a messy family drama. It was a standard, procedural eviction. I was no longer their wounded mother. I was their landlord. And they were my tenants. Tenants who had violated the most fundamental clause of any living arrangement, the clause of basic human decency, and they were about to be served with the consequences. The next morning I awoke with a sense of clarity and purpose I had not felt in years. The hurt was still there, a low, aching hum beneath the surface, but it was being rapidly eclipsed by a colder, more powerful emotion. The quiet, satisfying thrill of a well-researched and impeccably executed plan. While David and Brielle were undoubtedly downstairs, tiptoeing around in a state of anxious hungover dread, I was in my study, drafting the instruments of their eviction. I used the official state-approved templates I had downloaded the night before, ensuring that every word, every phrase was legally sound. The first document was the notice to quit. It was a masterpiece of cold, bureaucratic language. It formally identified them by name, stated the address of the property, and informed them that their at-will tenancy was being terminated. It gave them a date, exactly 30 days from the following day, by which they were required to vacate the premises and surrender possession to the owner. There was no emotion, no explanation, no room for negotiation. It was as impersonal and as final as a death certificate. The second document was a stroke of what I considered to be strategic genius. It was a standard month-to-month lease agreement. It was on its face an offer, a potential solution, an olive branch. But it was an olive branch I knew they could not possibly grasp. I spent a full hour researching the current market rates for comparable two-bedroom homes in my highly desirable neighborhood. I took the average of 3 different rental listings, and then I added another 10% for the convenience of a furnished space and included utilities. The final figure was $3,800 a month. The lease agreement stipulated the first month's rent and a security deposit of the same amount were due upon signing. At 9 a.m. I took the 2 documents to a local notary public and had them officially stamped and signed. The embossed seal, the crisp, authoritative signature of the notary, transformed them from simple pieces of paper into legally binding instruments of power. When I returned home, David and Brielle were in the kitchen, engaged in a tense, whispered argument that ceased the moment I walked in. They looked at me, their faces a mixture of fear, guilt, and a faint, lingering hope that I had cooled down, that the events of the previous evening had been a momentary outburst that could be smoothed over with a few empty apologies. I did not give them the chance to speak. I walked to the kitchen counter, the very one where Brielle so often staged her perfect artisanal toast for her blog, and I placed a single crisp white envelope upon its polished granite surface. Both their names were written on the front, in my neat, clear archivist's handwriting. "This is for you," I said, my voice calm and neutral. "I suggest you read it carefully." And with that, I turned and walked back to my study, closing the door softly behind me. The documents had been delivered. The file was now active. The 30-day clock had begun to tick. From the quiet sanctuary of my study, I listened to the unfolding of the drama. I did not need to see it. I could hear it. First, there was a period of silence as they presumably opened the envelope. Then I heard a sharp, incredulous gasp, followed by the rustle of paper, then a low, furious, and distinctly panicked whisper from Brielle. The whisper quickly escalated into a full-blown, hissing argument. I could not make out the individual words, but I could hear the tones. Brielle's voice, a rising frantic crescendo of rage and disbelief. David's a low, pleading and utterly ineffective murmur. I imagined the scene with a satisfying clarity. I saw them standing in my beautiful sunlit kitchen, the two legal documents spread out before them like the wreckage of a crashed plane. I saw Brielle's face, her carefully constructed mask of cool blogger-chic composure crumbling into a mask of pure ugly panic. I saw her eyes scanning the cold legalistic language of the notice to quit. The words vacate the premises and surrender possession, leaping out at her like a physical assault. Then I saw her snatching up the lease agreement, her eyes desperately searching for a loophole, a way out, only to land on the impossible, monstrous figure of the monthly rent. $3,800. It was a number that was so far outside the bounds of their reality that it might as well have been $1 billion. It was the moment of the great unmasking, the instant that the fragile credit-fueled illusion of their lifestyle was brutally unceremoniously stripped away. The whispering turned to shouting, the shouting turned to the sound of a door slamming. And then, a few moments later, there was a frantic, desperate pounding on the door of my study. I took a deep, steadying breath, composed my face into a mask of calm, professional neutrality and opened the door. They were both standing there, their faces flushed, their eyes wild with a mixture of anger and terror. Brielle was in the lead, the two legal documents clutched in her hand, shaking with the force of her rage. David hovered behind her, his face a pathetic, pleading mess. "What is this?" Brielle shrieked, waving the papers in my face. "Is this a joke?" "I can assure you," I said, my voice as calm and as steady as a stone, "that it is not a joke. It is a legally binding notification of a change in your tenancy status." "You can't do this," she sputtered, her voice cracking with a note of genuine, delicious panic. "You can't just throw us out. We're family." "The previous arrangement," I said, my voice a quiet, cutting correction, "was a familial one. It was based on a social contract of mutual respect, a contract which you last night made a very public and a very ugly show of voiding. This," I said, gesturing to the papers in her hand, "is a business arrangement, and I am simply exercising my rights as the property owner." David finally found his voice, a weak, desperate bleat. "Mom, please," he pleaded, his eyes swimming with unshed tears. "We're sorry. Brielle is sorry. She was stressed. She didn't mean it. Please, don't do this to us, to your family, to your grandchild." I looked at my son, at this weak, broken man who was still, even now, making excuses for the woman who had so viciously insulted his own mother, and I felt nothing. The maternal part of me, the part that would have once been moved by his tears, was gone. It had been cauterized, burned away by the acid of his betrayal. "The time for apologies has passed, David," I said, my voice cool and final. "The previous arrangement has been archived due to a breach of terms. The documents in your hand represent the current, active file. You have two options. You can sign the lease and begin paying the market rate rent, or you can find alternative housing within the next 30 days. The choice," I concluded, a faint, unapologetic echo of the real estate investor from the story I once read, "is entirely yours." I then gently but firmly closed the door to my study, leaving them to the ruins of the world they had so carelessly, so arrogantly and so beautifully destroyed. The week that followed was a masterclass in the corrosive, terrifying power of reality. Having been shut out of my study and my heart, David and Brielle were forced to confront the cold, hard and deeply unpleasant consequences of their own actions. Their first few days were spent in a state of furious, impotent denial. I could hear them through the walls, their arguments a constant, low-grade and deeply satisfying soundtrack to my own newfound peace. They were convinced that this was a bluff, a dramatic gesture on my part, a power play that I would eventually relent on. They were waiting for me to crack, to emerge from my study with a tearful maternal offer of reconciliation. They did not understand that the woman they were waiting for no longer existed. I heard them on the phone, their voices a mixture of false cheerfulness and barely concealed desperation as they began to explore the rental market. It was a brutal and long overdue education. They who had been living in a beautiful, spacious two-bedroom home in one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the city for the price of a weekly grocery bill, were now being confronted with the reality of what their actual income could afford. They were discovering that their combined salaries, the income of a high school music teacher and a moderately successful lifestyle blogger, did not in fact qualify them for a life of effortless, curated luxury. It qualified them for a cramped, one-bedroom apartment in a rundown building in a neighborhood far, far away from the tree-lined streets and artisanal coffee shops they had come to see as their birthright. I could chart the progress of their failure by the tone of their voices when they returned home each evening from another fruitless day of apartment hunting. The initial forced optimism quickly gave way to a weary, dejected silence. The sticker shock, the credit checks, the sheer humiliating reality of their financial situation was a bucket of ice-cold water thrown on the smoldering embers of their entitlement. They had believed themselves to be a power couple, a vibrant, successful pair on the verge of greatness. The rental market was now holding up a mirror to them, and the reflection it showed was of two people who had been living a lie, a comfortable, beautiful, and utterly fraudulent existence that had been entirely subsidized by the useless old woman they had so carelessly scorned. Their carefully constructed world, the one so beautifully curated for Brow's social media feed, was collapsing in on them, and the best part, the most deeply poetically just part, was that I did not have to do a thing. I did not have to argue. I did not have to gloat. I simply had to sit in my quiet, peaceful study, read my books, and let the cold, hard, and beautifully indifferent logic of the real world do my work for me. By the end of the first week, with the deadline of the eviction notice looming and no viable housing options in sight, Braille decided to play her final, and most desperate card. She decided to weaponize her only remaining asset, her social media following. It was a classic move of a modern narcissist. When faced with the consequences of your own actions, reframe the narrative, cast yourself as the victim, and appeal to the court of public opinion. Late one evening, I received a text from an old colleague from the university. It contained a link to Brielle's Instagram page. Augusta, the text read. I think you need to see this. I'm so sorry. I clicked the link, and there it was. Brielle had posted a video. It was a masterpiece of manipulative, performative victimhood. She was sitting in what was once my living room, the lighting soft and flattering, her hair perfectly coiffed, her makeup artfully applied to look as though she had been crying for hours. She spoke directly to the camera, her voice a soft, trembling, and utterly fraudulent whisper. She did not mention me by name. Of course, she was too clever for that. She spoke in vague, wounded generalities. She spoke of a difficult and heartbreaking family situation. She spoke of being pushed out of her home, her sanctuary, her nest, at the most vulnerable time of her life. She cradled her pregnant belly, a silent, powerful prop in her melodrama. She spoke of the emotional toll of being made to feel unwelcome and unsafe by a difficult and frankly unstable family member. She ended the video with a tearful, choked plea for positive energy and prayers, as she and her loving, supportive husband faced the unimaginable stress of being made homeless just weeks before the arrival of their first child. Her followers, her small army of online sycophants, took the bait immediately. The comment section was a torrent of misplaced sympathy and ignorant rage. Stay strong, mama. No one should have to go through this. Sending you so much love. That family member sounds like a toxic nightmare. This is elder abuse in reverse. You need to get a lawyer. Brielle was a masterful propagandist. She had created a piece of pure, unadulterated fiction, and her audience was eating it up. She believed she had me trapped. She believed that the threat of this public shaming campaign would force me to back down, to relent, to tear up the eviction notice and restore her to her rightful place as the queen of my rent-free castle. She had mistaken my desire for a quiet, private life for a fear of public confrontation, and that, like all her other calculations, was a fatal and a deeply satisfying mistake. I watched Brielle's video 3 times. The first time I felt a hot, sharp flash of rage. The second time I felt a cold, analytical curiosity at the sheer breathtaking audacity of her lies. The third time I felt nothing but the quiet, calm resolve of an archivist who has just discovered a fraudulent document, attempting to pass itself off as historical fact. My job was not to get angry. My job was not to engage in a messy, emotional public debate. My job was to correct the record, to present the primary source documents that would expose her narrative for the fiction that it was. I did not create a response video. I did not write a long defensive post. I simply scrolled down to the comments section of her post, and under my own clearly identified name, Augusta Redmond, I left a single devastatingly simple comment. My comment was not emotional, it was not accusatory. It was a masterpiece of factual takedown, a quiet, methodical, and utterly annihilating presentation of the undisputed, mathematical truth. It read, Brielle, I am so sorry to hear that you are going through such a difficult time. Since you have chosen to make this private family matter a public one, I feel it is only right to provide some of the missing context for your followers. The home you are being pushed out of is my property, which I own outright. For the past 3 years and 4 months, you and my son have lived in this home completely rent-free. As my guests, the current market rate for a comparable home in this neighborhood is approximately $3,800 a month. By my calculation, this arrangement has represented a total financial gift from me to you of approximately $52,000. The decision to terminate this arrangement was made after you at my dinner table called me a loser for taking an early retirement for health reasons. I wish you and David the best of luck in finding a new home that better fits your budget. I typed the last word, read the comment one more time to ensure its tone of calm, factual and utterly devastating neutrality was perfect. And then I hit post. The effect was instantaneous. It was like dropping a single cold hard fact into a bubbling cauldron of sentimental misinformed nonsense. My comment, with its clear undeniable numbers and its quiet unassailable statement of fact, did not just challenge Brielle's victim narrative, it vaporized it. It was the primary source document that exposed her story as a complete and utter fraud. The fallout in the comments section was a beautiful, glorious and deeply satisfying thing to behold. Her followers, who had just moments before been a unified chorus of sympathy and outrage, were now a confused and rapidly turning mob. The first few responses were of disbelief. Followers trying to defend their queen. There must be a misunderstanding. This can't be true. But my comment was a rock of undeniable fact in a sea of emotional fiction. It had the simple, unassailable power of the truth, and it was followed a few minutes later by a second comment, this one from an old colleague of mine from the university. A woman who knew me, who knew my character and who had been to my home. I can attest to the fact that Augusta Redmond is one of the kindest, most generous people I have ever known, she wrote, and the home in question is indeed hers. That was all it took. The dam of public opinion broke. The tide of sympathy for Brielle receded in an instant, replaced by a tsunami of scorn and ridicule. The comments began to flood in, a torrent of righteous digital fury. Wait. So you've been living for free in a $150,000 gift of a home, and you're complaining? Did you really call the woman who was housing you for free a loser? The entitlement is breathtaking. This is the most shameless grift I have ever seen. You should be ashamed of yourself. Her own followers, the small army she had tried to weaponize against me, had turned on her with a vengeance. They were not just questioning her story, they were questioning her entire brand, her entire carefully constructed identity as a successful aspirational lifestyle guru. She was being exposed in real time on her own platform as a fraud, a grifter, and a breathtakingly ungrateful parasite. I did not engage any further. I did not need to. My single factual comment was a self-replicating virus of truth, and it was doing its work beautifully. I closed my laptop and went to make a cup of tea. A few hours later, I checked her page again. The video was gone. An hour after that, her entire Instagram profile, the digital monument to her own vanity and insecurity, had been deleted. She had been publicly, comprehensively and humiliatingly defeated, not by an emotional outburst, not by a messy public fight, but by a single quiet and irrefutable archival correction. Her carefully curated world, her entire professional identity had been destroyed by a single factual comment, and the silence that followed was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. The public humiliation was the final, decisive battle. The war was over. All that remained was the slow, sad, and deeply satisfying retreat of the vanquished army. With their public shaming campaign in ruins and their financial reality unchanged, David and Brielle were left with no options, no leverage, and no hope. They had to face the undeniable and rapidly approaching deadline of the 30-day eviction notice. The last 2 weeks of their residency in my home were a quiet, somber affair. The furious arguments ceased, replaced by a heavy, defeated silence. I would hear them moving around downstairs, the sounds of boxes being packed, of furniture being disassembled. They were no longer the arrogant, entitled king and queen of their stolen castle. They were just two people who had made a catastrophic mistake and were now living with the quiet, mundane and soul-crushing consequences. The day of their departure was a gray, overcast Saturday, the weather a perfect somber reflection of the occasion. I watched from my study window as a small, slightly rusted U-Haul truck pulled up to the curb. It looked absurdly small, a pathetic, inadequate vessel for the life they had built within my walls. I watched as they began the slow, arduous process of moving their belongings out of my house. David was doing most of the heavy lifting. His shoulders slumped, his face a mask of weary, hollowed-out despair. He moved with the slow, shuffling gait of a man who had lost everything. Brielle, in her advanced state of pregnancy, was directing the move from the porch, her her voice a low, sullen murmur. The arrogant, defiant fire in her eyes was gone, replaced by a dull, resentful emptiness. She was wearing sweatpants and a stained t-shirt, her designer outfits and aspirational aesthetic a distant, mocking memory. They were a portrait of ruin, a living testament to the corrosive, destructive power of their own greed. I felt a flicker of something in my chest as I watched them. It was not triumph. It was not joy. It was a quiet, resolute sadness. A sadness for the son I had lost, for the good, kind man he might have been before he had allowed his own weakness to be consumed by his wife's monstrous entitlement. A sadness for the grandchild, who was about to be born into a world of chaos and resentment. But beneath the sadness there was no regret. There was only the calm, unshakable certainty that I had done the right thing. I had not caused their ruin. I had simply refused to continue financing it. I had refused to be the foundation for a house built on a bedrock of disrespect. By late afternoon, the truck was loaded. David came to my study door one last time. He did not knock. He just stood there, his hand on the doorknob, his gaze fixed on the floor. "The key is on the kitchen counter," he mumbled, his voice a thick, defeated whisper. He did not look at me, he could not. "Okay, David," I said, my own voice quiet and neutral. In the months that followed, a quiet, orderly peace settled over my home. I reclaimed the space, not with a sense of triumphant conquest, but with a feeling of gentle restorative care. It was like restoring a damaged, neglected archive, carefully cleaning away the grime, repairing the tears, and putting everything back in its proper logical place. The first thing I did was to hire a team of professional cleaners. They scrubbed the house from top to bottom, purging the lingering energy of their resentment and entitlement. The 2 large bedrooms at the front of the house, the ones that had been their domain, I decided to repurpose. The master bedroom, with its large sunny windows, I turned into my personal library. I had custom bookshelves built, filling them with the beloved volumes I had kept in storage for years. It became a room of light, of knowledge, of quiet, intellectual joy. The second bedroom, the one that had been intended as the nursery, I turned into a proper working archive. I purchased acid-free boxes and archival quality shelving. I began the long, satisfying project of organizing my family's history. Old photographs, letters from my parents, Samuel's architectural drawings, my own academic papers. It was my life, my history, and I was its sole and rightful custodian. I was not lonely. The silence I had once feared was now a comfort, a welcome friend. I reconnected with my own life, with the friends and the passions that had been pushed to the side by the demands of my small, toxic family unit. My health improved. My blood pressure returned to normal. The stress that had been a constant low-grade poison in my system was gone. I was at peace. A few months after they had left, just before the holidays, a single piece of correspondence arrived from them. It was a cheap, generic holiday card. Inside was a photograph. It showed David and Brielle, holding their new baby, a beautiful little girl. They were standing in a cramped, generic apartment. The walls a depressing shade of beige. The furniture cheap and functional. They were smiling for the camera, but their smiles were strained, hollow things. They did not reach their eyes. Brielle looked tired and bitter, and David just looked lost. I took the card and I placed it in a small archival box. On the label I wrote, in my neat, clear script, "Family History Archived." I then placed the box on a high shelf in my new archive, closed the lid, and turned back to my work. The record was complete. The file was closed, and I was finally at peace in the quiet, orderly sanctuary of my own, reclaimed life.